White cop lies about black woman in court, not knowing she's a high-ranking Navy SEAL. You underestimated me, Officer Simmons, but the truth always finds a way. What could make a courtroom fall silent in shock? A police officer accuses a black woman of resisting arrest and assault. His story, convincing until she takes the stand and turns the entire case upside down. Who is she? And why does her testimony leave the officer, the jury, and even the judge stunned? This is the story of how one lie unraveled, and a fight for justice became a fight for truth. Let's dive into it. The early morning sun peeked through the heavy drapes of the courtroom, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. The room, though grand in design, felt suffocating. Rows of wooden benches were filled with a mix of spectators, curious townsfolk, journalists jotting notes, and a few faces lined with quiet tension. Among them sat Monica Jackson. Her calm exterior betrayed none of the turmoil beneath the surface. Her dark brown skin glowed faintly under the artificial light, and her neatly braided hair rested on her shoulders. Monica sat upright, her back straight as if guided by an invisible string, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. She was dressed modestly in a crisp white blouse and black slacks, a deliberate choice to exude humility and respect. Yet her sharp eyes scanned the room with precision, taking in every face, every movement. To the casual observer, she looked like any other defendant. But to those paying close attention, there was something unusual about her. A quiet intensity that seemed out of place for someone accused of a violent crime. The bailiff called the court to order, and all eyes turned to the front of the room. Judge Howard Grayson, an older white man with thinning silver hair, entered. He carried an air of authority, though his face betrayed a weariness that came from years of presiding over cases he'd rather forget. This one, however, seemed to ignite a spark of interest in him. Perhaps it was the presence of Officer Bradley Simmons, sitting smugly at the plaintiff's table. Or the murmurings of a case that had already captured the attention of local news outlets. State versus Monica Jackson, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Monica rose, her movements deliberate and controlled, and faced the judge. The whispers in the room grew louder as people craned their necks for a better view. Officer Simmons leaned back in his chair, his expression one of confidence, almost amusement. Dressed sharply in his police uniform, the officer exuded the kind of arrogance that comes from years of unquestioned authority. Monica's lawyer, Benjamin Carter, a young black attorney fresh out of law school, shuffled nervously through his notes. He glanced at Monica, hoping to find reassurance in her face, but she didn't return the look. Her eyes remained fixed on the judge, her expression unreadable. Carter took a deep breath and stood. "Your Honor," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "we are prepared to proceed." The judge nodded, his gaze shifting to Simmons. "Officer Simmons, you may take the stand." The officer rose, every movement exaggerated as if he were performing for an unseen audience. He adjusted his uniform before making his way to the witness stand, pausing briefly to glance at Monica. His smirk was faint but unmistakable. A predator, sure of his prey. As he took the oath, Monica studied him. She observed the way his fingers fidgeted slightly, the subtle shift in his posture as he sat down. These were details most would overlook. But Monica catalogued them with the precision of someone trained to read body language. She didn't flinch. Didn't move. As Simmons began to speak. On the evening in question, Simmons began, his voice steady and loud enough to carry across the room. "I was responding to a disturbance call near the east side of town. I encountered the defendant, Miss Jackson, loitering outside a closed business. There were murmurs in the courtroom. Loitering was often used as a catch-all accusation, especially against people of color." Simmons pressed on, seemingly unfazed. "When I approached her and asked what she was doing there, she immediately became hostile," he continued, his tone taking on a theatrical quality. "She refused to identify herself, raised her voice, and when I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she physically assaulted me." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Monica remained still. Her face, a mask of calm. Simmons shifted in his seat, feigning a pained expression. "She hit me in the chest and attempted to reach for my service weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her. From the back of the room, a woman's voice muttered, "Sounds like a lie." Heads turned. But the judge quickly called for order. "Thank you, Officer Simmons," Judge Grayson said, his voice neutral. "You may step down." Monica's lawyer rose, visibly nervous. "Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to ask the court to consider, save it for your cross-examination, Mr. Carter," the judge interrupted. "Let's move on." Monica exhaled softly. Her patience was being tested. But she didn't let it show. She leaned slightly toward Carter, whispering, "Stay calm. Focus on the facts." Carter nodded, though he looked far from reassured. As the prosecution rested its case, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Simmons returned to his seat, his smirk now a full grin. He exchanged a glance with his fellow officers seated in the back row. Monica didn't miss the wink he gave them. "Miss Jackson," the judge said, his tone carrying an edge of skepticism. "It's your turn to testify." Monica stood, smoothing her blouse as she approached the stand. The room fell silent as she took her seat, the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her. She adjusted the microphone in front of her, her movements slow and deliberate. "Miss Jackson," the prosecutor began, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and a sharper tongue. "Can you explain your actions on the night in question?" Monica leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and measured. "I can. But first, I need to clarify one thing. The officer's account is not only inaccurate but intentionally misleading. There was a collective intake of breath." The prosecutor smirked. "Bold accusation, Miss Jackson. Do you have any proof to back it up?" Monica met his gaze, her dark eyes unyielding. "I believe the truth will come to light soon enough." The prosecutor opened his mouth to retort, but Monica's calm confidence left him momentarily speechless. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, signaling for the questioning to continue. As Monica began to recount her version of events, the tension in the room became palpable. The audience hung on her every word, sensing that this was no ordinary defendant. Unbeknownst to everyone, the wheels of justice were already turning. And the carefully constructed lies of Officer Simmons were beginning to unravel. Monica took a slow breath, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling on the prosecutor. "Let's start with the facts," she said, her voice even. "I was not loitering. I was standing outside the building waiting for my rideshare after leaving a charity event for veterans." She let that information settle. A flicker of surprise crossed the prosecutor's face. "Veterans," he repeated, his tone skeptical. "Yes," Monica confirmed. "I work closely with several organizations that support military service members transitioning to civilian life." She turned her head slightly, looking directly at Officer Simmons. "And I have served this country for over 20 years. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Simmons' smirk faltered. The prosecutor quickly recovered. "Miss Jackson, your background is irrelevant if you were refusing to cooperate with an officer's lawful orders." Monica tilted her head. "Is that what Officer Simmons claims?" The prosecutor straightened his posture. "He testified that you became hostile, refused to identify yourself, and then assaulted him." Monica exhaled sharply. "Let me be very clear. That's a lie." A stunned silence filled the room. The judge raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Miss Jackson, I'd advise you to tread carefully with your words." Monica nodded respectfully. "I understand, Your Honor. But I also understand the weight of truth." She turned back to the prosecutor. "Officer Simmons approached me aggressively. He didn't ask questions, he made accusations. He accused me of trespassing, despite there being no such complaint. When I attempted to explain, he interrupted me, demanding identification in a manner that was unprofessional and unnecessary." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I complied. I gave him my driver's license." Another murmur swept through the audience. Simmons shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The prosecutor frowned. "And what happened next?" Monica's eyes darkened. He took my ID, looked at it, then accused me of presenting a fake. Gasps filled the courtroom. Even the judge's expression changed slightly. The prosecutor, caught off guard, hesitated before responding. Why would he accuse you of that? Monica let a moment pass before she spoke. Because of my name. Because it didn't match the image he had in his head. Silence. The prosecutor attempted to regain control. Let's not speculate, Miss Jackson. Stick to the events. Monica gave a small nod. After he called my ID fake, I calmly told him to verify it in his system. He refused. Instead, he escalated. He told me to turn around and put my hands on my head. She inhaled slowly. I asked if I was under arrest. He didn't answer. I asked what crime I had committed. Again, no answer. She turned her gaze to the jury. And then, without warning, he grabbed my wrist, twisted my arm behind my back, and slammed me against the hood of his cruiser. A shocked murmur ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor straightened his tie. You're saying Officer Simmons used excessive force? Monica's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm saying he never had probable cause to detain me in the first place. The judge rubbed his temple. Miss Jackson, do you have any evidence to support this claim? A slow smile spread across Monica's face. As a matter of fact, I do. She glanced toward her lawyer, who nodded and stood up. Your Honor, the defense would like to submit video evidence into the record. A sharp intake of breath came from Simmons. His confidence wavered as his attorney quickly turned to him, whispering urgently. The judge gestured for the bailiff to collect the evidence. Proceed, he said. The courtroom fell into a hush as the screen at the front of the room lit up. A grainy but clear video played. It was taken from a security camera positioned across the street. It showed Monica standing calmly outside the building. Officer Simmons approached, his body language aggressive from the start. The video had no audio, but the visuals were damning. Monica handed him her ID. He looked at it, then suddenly grabbed her wrist. The room gasped as they watched him yank her arm behind her back and slam her onto the hood of his car. The footage continued, Monica lying still, restrained, as Simmons tightened the cuffs unnecessarily. Then, something even more shocking happened. Another officer arrived on the scene. A female officer. She approached Simmons, exchanged a few words. Then gestured toward Monica's ID, which she had picked up from the ground. She walked back to the patrol car, checked something on the onboard computer, and her entire posture changed. The footage showed her confronting Simmons. Her gestures were sharp, her expression tense. Then, she removed Monica's handcuffs. The video cut off. A heavy silence settled over the room. The judge leaned forward. Who is that officer? He asked. Monica turned to her lawyer, who handed over a document. That officer is Lieutenant Rachel Hayes, her attorney said. And this is her official statement, confirming that Miss Jackson's ID was real and that Officer Simmons ignored protocol. The color drained from Simmons' face. His attorney buried his face in his hands. Judge Grayson scanned the document before turning to Simmons. Officer Simmons, he said slowly. It appears you have some explaining to do. The room erupted into whispers. The prosecutor, visibly shaken, cleared his throat. Your Honor, I request a brief recess. Denied, the judge said firmly. He turned to Monica. Miss Jackson, do you have anything else to say? Monica stood. Her voice, steady and unwavering. Yes, Your Honor. I believe the actions of Officer Simmons were not only unlawful but also indicative of a larger problem, one where certain officers believe they can lie, manipulate, and abuse their power without consequence. She turned her head, looking directly at Simmons. You thought I was just another person you could intimidate. But what you didn't know. She took a step forward. What no one in this courtroom knew. A slow, dramatic pause. She straightened her shoulders. I am Lieutenant Commander Monica Jackson of the United States Navy SEALs. The courtroom exploded. Gasps. Murmurs. Someone dropped a pen. The judge's eyes widened. Simmons' mouth fell open. Even the prosecutor looked stunned. Monica let the revelation settle before continuing. I have served my country for over 20 years. I have led teams in high-stakes missions across the globe. I have fought for the very freedoms that allow this courtroom to exist. And yet, in my own country, in my own city, I was treated as if my identity, my humanity, my dignity meant nothing. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I am not just fighting for myself. I am fighting for every person who has ever been falsely accused, mistreated, and humiliated by those who swore to protect them. A beat of silence. Then, the judge sighed deeply. Officer Simmons, he said, his voice carrying a heavy weight. You are hereby stripped of your badge, effective immediately. And this court will be pursuing perjury charges against you. Simmons looked as if the ground had been ripped from under him. His lawyer whispered frantically, but it was too late. Justice had already taken its course. The judge turned to Monica. Miss Jackson, Lieutenant Commander Jackson, he corrected himself. This court owes you an apology. Monica gave a respectful nod. Thank you, Your Honor. But an apology is only the beginning. We need real change. She turned to face the courtroom. And as she did, for the first time since this ordeal began, the people in that room truly saw her. Not just as a defendant. Not just as a black woman. But as a warrior. As a force to be reckoned with. And above all, as a truth that could not be silenced. 1 week later, Internal Affairs Investigation Monica Jackson sat across from 2 Internal Affairs officers in a quiet conference room at the police department. The walls were bare, except for the department's insignia and a framed statement about integrity, one that now felt ironic. Officer Simmons was officially under investigation, but Monica wasn't naive. She knew how these cases often went. Lieutenant Commander Jackson, the lead investigator, a tall woman with sharp features, said, "Thank you for coming in." Monica nodded. "You need my official statement," she said plainly. The investigator exchanged a glance with her partner. "Yes. And we need to talk about any legal action you plan to take." Monica folded her hands on the table. "I haven't made that decision yet," she admitted. She wasn't the type to sue for personal gain. But this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been in her position without a courtroom full of people to witness the truth. "You should consider it," the second investigator, an older black man with graying hair, said. "It would send a message." Monica exhaled slowly. "I don't just want a message. I want real change." Officer Simmons' downfall across town. Bradley Simmons sat in his lawyer's office, staring at the paperwork in front of him. His badge gone. His reputation destroyed. He was facing perjury charges, excessive force complaints, and a likely civil lawsuit. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of it all. "Is there a way out of this?" he asked his lawyer. The older man shook his head. "You lied under oath. The video evidence is damning. And now, Lieutenant Commander Jackson is being hailed as a hero." Simmons clenched his jaw. "This isn't fair," he muttered. His lawyer gave him a long, unimpressed look. "Fair," he repeated. "You did this to yourself." For the first time, Simmons had to sit with that truth. And it was suffocating. Monica's decision. A week later, Monica stood outside a community center, speaking with a group of young recruits considering military service. She had been invited to speak about leadership and integrity. But after what had happened, she had a different message. "It's not enough to be strong," she told them. "You have to stand for something. You have to be willing to fight on and off the battlefield." One young woman raised her hand. "Ma'am, do you think things will really change after what happened?" Monica thought about it. Then she smiled slightly. "Change doesn't happen overnight. But every battle we win gets us closer." And as she walked away that evening, she knew her fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. 1 month later, the lawsuit and public reaction, the headlines had been relentless. Decorated Navy SEAL falsely arrested by disgraced officer. Ex-officer Simmons faces lawsuit and criminal charges. Monica Jackson's case sparks national debate on police misconduct. Monica hadn't wanted to file a lawsuit at first. But after receiving dozens of letters, emails, and social media messages from people who had faced similar injustices without cameras or courtroom witnesses to save them, she knew she had to act. "This isn't just about me," she told her attorney, Benjamin Carter, as they prepared the lawsuit. "It's about making sure no one else goes through this." The lawsuit demanded accountability not just from Simmons, but from the entire police department. It named the city, the police chief, and even the mayor, forcing them to answer for a system that allowed officers like Simmons to abuse their power. And the public? They were watching. Marches. Protests. Calls for reform. Monica's case had become a symbol, one the city's leadership could no longer ignore. Officer Simmons, the fall from Grace Bradley Simmons, sat in his tiny apartment, staring at the eviction notice on his door. After losing his job, the legal fees had drained his savings. His former colleagues had distanced themselves. No police department would hire him. And now, with Monica's lawsuit moving forward, he was facing financial ruin. He turned on the TV, only to see her face on the news. Lieutenant Commander Jackson has announced a police reform initiative, working alongside city officials to ensure better accountability and bias training within law enforcement. Simmons threw the remote across the room. It wasn't supposed to end like this. He had always been the one in control. And now, he was nothing. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. 6 months later, a new beginning. The courtroom was packed. This time, it wasn't Monica on trial. It was the system itself. The lawsuit had forced major reforms. Several officers were under investigation. New policies were being put in place. And Monica? She was there not as a victim, but as a leader. Lieutenant Commander Jackson, the mayor said at a press conference. "We are honored to work with you in shaping a better future for this city." Monica nodded. This wasn't about honor. It was about justice. And she would make sure it lasted. As Monica walked out of City Hall, her phone buzzed. A text from Benjamin Carter. "We won." Monica exhaled, looking up at the sky. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope. The battle wasn't over. But today, justice had won. And tomorrow? She'd be ready for whatever came next.